The interesting thing about Toni Morrison as a literary critic is that she was totally trained in the old paradigm. She was born in the early 30s. She went to graduate school at Cornell in the late 50s, and she was totally trained in the new criticism, where we did, as we discussed before, close formal readings of works, with, because new criticisms really didn't do much with the novel, bit of Labachian novelistic formalism, and if you did American literature, you also got some thematic stuff in American studies, thematic paradigms. Leo Marx's The Machine and the Garden, things like that. The myth and symbol school of Americanist criticism, which was, unlike the new criticism, thematic, but it shared with the new criticism a sense of not wanting to get too political and historical, a sense of elevating the archetypal over the merely circumstantial, even if with some of these American novels, there had to be a kind of historical or cultural subtext in some way. In essence, it adhered to what I call, in the preface to Theory, the Rizal symbolic. And what's interesting about Morrison, when she writes her literary criticism in the 90s, she doesn't deal with deconstruction or any sort of theory in the sense that we've been studying it. She stays within the kind of tools that her studies gave her, but she totally inverts them. She looks at race as a variable which had been completely suppressed. And she's not talking about race in works by African-American writers. She's talking about race in works by white writers. And she's particularly talking about race in works by white writers that does not seem to be there. And Morrison pointed out the African-American character in Moby Dick, Pip, who those of you who take the course with me next semester we will talk about Pip. But Morrison kind of told the academic establishment that Pip was there, and that race in an African-American sense, not just a Polynesian or a Parsi or whatever, but an African-American, was in Moby Dick. She gives a very interesting reading, looking at works by white authors that are classic canonical texts that people have talked about, that white critics talked about for many years and did not realize they were African-American characters, just because they were blinded by their own racial presuppositions. The book she talks about in our excerpt is Willa Cather's book, Sapphira and the Slaver, which is a very interesting book. Cather's last completed novel came out the same year as the movie of Gone with the Wind came out. Compared to that, it was very liberal in racial terms. There's no doubt. It's similarly a book set around the time of the Civil War and dealing with slavery. There's no doubt about the sympathies with the book with an abolitionist and northern position. And Sapphira, who is the anti-black racist character in the book, is the villain of the book. But Morrison makes a very telling observation that the crisis of Nancy, the African-American woman, the slave, who is sexually assaulted by Martin Colbert, Sapphira's nephew by marriage, and also secretly in a more high-minded and repressed way lusted after by Henry Colbert, Sapphira's do-gooding husband who's kind of tormented by his own longings. The drama of the book is Nancy gets out of there and gets away from the mill house and goes to Canada and comes back eventually as an adult speaking in an impeccable Canadian accent. But it is very much just about Nancy as an individual and not about the social issue of slavery as such. It tries in Morrison's reading to sidestep the problem of slavery by dealing with the issue of one slave, but not dealing with it as a collective issue. Morrison also, and this is kind of a very formalistic reading, she notes that at the end of the book, and this is the only time Willa Cather in her career ever does this, and this is when she steps out of that Labachian third-person limited point of view. We saw that in McCullers, and talks in the first person. It's as if McCullers, at the end of Member of the Wedding, has little posters saying, I, Carson McCullers, am and am not Frankie, or so on. And McCullers, of course, doesn't do this. Cather does it, which in the day as we talked about, the limited third-person point of view was stream of consciousness for those writers who couldn't or didn't feel like doing it. In the day, breaking that limited third person was very daring for Cather. And it's a very interesting formal device. Morrison, though, reads it as kind of saying, oh, all of this suffering of this African-American woman, the fact that her mother, Till, as we see in the essay, doesn't even know where she is, and has to find out from Rachel, Sapphira's daughter, who helps Nancy's escape. All of this suffering of this African-American woman is for the white person. That's what all of this is for. All of this is kind of a dialectical evolution for the white person's own literary self-consciousness. And Morrison is not indicting Cather. In fact, she makes clear that she applauds Cather for daring to write about racial issues. And this is an important point. A lot of people reading Edward Said's Orientalism have taken to criticizing any representation of a non-white community by a white writer, or any representation of an other by an other, any kind of cross-identity representation as Orientalist or as imperialist or as appropriating. Morrison says, no, it's better for the white writer to try and fail to write about race than to act as if it didn't exist. And that's what she really is attacking, as acting as if an aesthetic reading of a novel. You don't have to talk about race. Morrison is doing a very aesthetic, very formal reading of these novels. She is a writer herself, and she talks about how her own writerliness informs her reading of these books. She's doing a formalist reading, and yet she is not excluding the African-American material. And we talked about last time, people can now, you now can do a queer formalism, a feminist formalism, an African-American formalism. And Morrison is, in a way, one of the first critics to do an identity formalism, or a formalism that doesn't just paper over identities. And she very much admires how far Cather has gone, but she does make the point, you know, isn't it almost inevitable? I think, is my kitty cat going to come into the picture? Is Garbo going to talk? Let's see, no, she is shying away. But she's in the background, beautiful, serene, enigmatic, as always. Morrison applauds Cather for taking that step. But she does note, you know, isn't it interesting, all the African-American characters suffering, it's for the little white girl to have her little epiphany at the end. And she says, you know, ooh, this is one of the ironies of race in America, is so often in books or films by white people, the racial theme is there to show how the white people are enlightened and have grown and have developed. And it is a kind of dialectical exploitation of the African-American character. It's very interesting comparing her to Morrison to Bobha and to Gates. Both Bobha and Gates are Derridians. They are using Derrida's ideas of linguistic plurality and excess and difference to talk about the ways in which anti-racist discourse can be produced. For Bobha, the sheer multiplicity of colonial reference, the way colonization parodies the original colonizer in the very paradox of deploying colonization. Colonization parodies itself. There's kind of this mimetic superflux. And the British, for instance, in trying to put in place colonial governmentality in India, Mike Griffiths of Columbia is going to speak to us, and he's working in colonial governmentality. And I'm going to come and ask, I'm going to actually write him and ask him to focus his stuff on colonial governmentality. Colonial governmentality actually undoes its own authority by proliferation. You know, with Gates, he's talking more about how not the discourse of colonization, but African-American representation itself. And unlike Morrison, who was writing, as we see her, about the representation of African-Americans in books by whites, Gates is writing about African-American literature and constructing an African-American tradition. And in talking about signifying, he's talking about how an African-American tradition, a seemingly disempowered tradition, nonetheless constitutes its own set of structures and precedents, which is very difficult and very brave to do when one is disempowered. And he is talking about how, again, politics and language are not contradictory. When you do a political reading, you do not exclude language. That an awareness of language can work in a political understanding of African American texts, and in fact can give a far richer understanding than a protest agenda, a simply polemical agenda. A final postscript on Gates, and I talk about this in Chapter 4 of Theory. President Obama would not have been possible without Gates, and would not have been possible without Kwame Appiah, and without Cornel West, and without all the African-American public intellectuals of the 90s who argued, the famous end of Ellison's Invisible Man, who knows but that on the lower frequencies I speak for you, argued that an African-American intellectual could be an American intellectual per se. Albert Murray, going back a couple of generations, was an important predecessor here, who Gates writes a very interesting essay on. And Gates, although he has become much more popular, he's become much more of a media personality. I don't think he does much literary theory these days, but Gates did employ European literary theory, particularly that of Derrida, to help make himself a public intellectual and make congruent an African-American vision of political critique and the idea of American public discourse as such. And without that, a figure like Barack Obama could not have signified in the discourse. And you could read more about that in End of Chapter 4 in Theory, which happily now has 4 more years to be relevant, which both for altruistic and selfish reasons very much pleases me. Okay, have a good Thanksgiving, and I'll see you afterwards.